Hi, good morning, everyone. Morning. Hi. Right, so we're just about to start off on the opening panel, where we're going to talk about the importance of data visibility and about how do organizations leverage data visibility as part of their supply chain. And hopefully everyone here is going to have a fantastic day. There's a really good agenda that Leon and his team have pulled together, talking about multiple different aspects of the supply chain. But what we're going to start off with is just the opening panel discussion. And really what I want to do is to have the discussion and maybe leave a little bit of time at the end for any questions that you've got for the opening panel. So let me initially introduce the members of the opening panel who we've got here. So on the far end is Robert Byrne, who is the Vice President of and General Manager of Forecasting Solutions at E2Open. Next to him, we've got Dominic Policella, who is from Board International. Then we have Mick Jones, who in true logistics style has just flown in from San Francisco and has arrived here 5 minutes, so just in time for the opening panel. So he's got his timing absolutely right, and I think this is very typical of typical of the international jet-setting life that supply chain professionals run. But he's a former senior vice president of Lenovo. Unfortunately, one of our panel members didn't quite get the logistics right, and Fabio Rubio from PMI hasn't been able to attend today. I think it shows that clearly the performance of a company is like that. We sometimes get things a little bit wrong. And I'm Matthew Spooner. So I'm a research director within Gartner. I lead our research around sales and operations planning, demand planning, and supply planning. But previously, I was ran the planning organization in Ericsson, or one of Ericsson's business units. So most of my career has been spent in similar operational type processes. So what I want to do, just as we open up the panel, is to pose the first question, which I'll sort of ask Robert to answer initially, and then we'll move on to the other panel members. But we see the people and organizations consider the supply chain not just within their own four walls, but they actually consider the end-to-end supply chain more and more. What do customers do? What do suppliers do? So what we're seeing on the increasingly in terms of data visibility and collaboration, we see on the downstream supply chain side, we see companies moving towards basing their plans on moving away from sell-in to looking to sell out and even sell through information in order to improve the accuracy of the accuracy and the visibility of their plans with customers. But we also see on the upstream supply chain side far more collaboration with tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 suppliers, partly as a means of ensuring certainty of supply, but also in terms of ethical considerations. So we've seen in the past with a couple of years ago with the horse meat scandal, but we also see the increasing collaboration with conflict, trying to identify conflict minerals, eliminate child labor from supply chain. So this is becoming more and more important on the upstream as well. So Robert, maybe you would talk about, certainly from E2Open and a lot of the work that you've been doing with other organizations. To what extent and how do companies use collaboration and visibility in their supply chains to deal with these type of considerations?
Sure. So, sorry. I think there's supply chain has always been multi-enterprise, and it's really now people are beginning to actually leverage that capability, that the fact that it is multi-enterprise, and begin sharing data. So our customers range from Dell that goes 7 layers deep into their suppliers to a Procter & Gamble that's gathering data from dozens of retailers, and using them overall to improve demand planning, demand prediction. I think one of the things that needs to be happening that isn't quite happening yet is there's a lot more data. You need a lot more automated collaboration. It's sort of the days when you can get a spreadsheet mailed to you from a customer and somehow sit there and interpret that, tweak your plans are really kind of gone. So I know a lot of people have focused on collaboration, but I think it's the automated piece of it that will really drive the benefits.
Mick, do you want to, if we come into maybe a more of an end user perspective?
Is that working?
Yeah, it's working.
So firstly, apologies for the notes. There's no way I can do this without notes after being on a plane for 11 hours. Apologies for Dominic, because this suit has been on for about 18 hours. So if Dominic sort of shuffles that way a little bit, you'll know why.
There's a reason why I'm not sitting there.
Yeah, exactly. End user perspective. So I think that in Lenovo and other roles, I've always looked at data as a method of delivering value. And I think that supply chains now are about, they are, you could almost say the data in the supply chain is almost as important as the things that it moves now, because that's what supply chains are. They're just things that move data. And I think we're at a point where we've gone through a number of phases, if you like, of delivering value in the supply chain. The first one was the easy one. It was procurement. It was, you bought stuff better because you bought more of it. The second one was sort of integration. You looked at your supply chain and you integrated your transport and your warehousing and your operations. And we're sort of at the third level now of delivering value in the supply chain, which is collaboration. And data, to me, is the core of that collaboration process. I think that collaboration process will split into two. It'll be sort of, and I always get these wrong, it'll be inter-organizational collaboration, which most of us do to some degree in our organizations. And then it'll become sort of intra-ecosystem type collaboration. It'll be collaboration between different parts of your supply chain and different supply chains. So for me, the data's about that sort of collaborative effort to deliver the next frontier, if you like, of value. And I think it's quite interesting now. You look at things like tech, where the supply-demand process in tech, it's never been easy. We're not the greatest forecasters of supply and demand in the world. But actually now it's got even more complicated because the supply end has become quite volatile. More SKUs, sort of lower product life cycles, real risk, different sourcing. So that's sort of out of sync a little bit. And the sort of demand end's the same, with the consumer becoming very democratic and deciding they want one of something in a specific place. So that what used to be a really easy skipping rope that you'd sort of turn has now become quite a difficult thing to predict. And I think it just means that whole concept of sharing data in the supply chain becomes even more important now. To try and sort of predict a very, very unpredictable relationship between those two ends. Yeah, that wasn't a bad start, was it?
And it's difficult to go third because I echo the words of both the gentlemen before me. So I agree with all of that. I think what I would add is if we look at the supply chain, our internal business supply chain, so linking still, the internal supply chain from demand into output, so demand to output, and is that linkage there yet in terms of that transparency and collaboration between maybe a demand plan and a supply plan and back into a financial plan? So when we look at this, when we look at collaboration, the way we look at this is, well, let's make sure that there is internal collaboration across our supply chain, as was maybe the boundaries of our four walls to our suppliers. And now with technology and digital, we can then go deeper into then our suppliers. So I think when we look at collaboration, it's making sure that it's, from our internal walls, from the demand plan and changing forecast all the way now down to what our suppliers doing, the ethics, the volume, the value, the capacity, and being able to analyze that, but also then predict and run scenarios. And that's, for us, the end-to-end supply chain, the digital supply chain, we call it now.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that was some very good answers there. And I think probably what I wanted to move on to is maybe a little bit of an extension of that. And I'll probably go back to my own experience. So I worked in the high-tech industry for most of my career. In the high-tech industry in the late 90s, early 2000s, they started to move much more towards outsourced manufacturing. And so, where you had your own manufacturing, you obviously used to collaborate and share plans. And then when you moved to outsourced manufacturing, it became a situation where initially where you'd think, great, that's somebody else who's taken that over. We can go and throw all of those problems over the wall to those partners, and they can deal with everything. And I think in the high-tech industry, who were very early, I think, in outsourcing, they realized pretty rapidly after the performance dropped off that actually you need to collaborate extensively and have some specific rules around, how do you treat that information. Now, where I see other organizations now moving towards that doing more and more outsourcing in terms of both logistics and in terms of manufacturing, that, the perception is that degree of collaboration becomes more important, but it's not just about sharing the information. It's about, well, what's the rules of engagement when you sort of pass that information over? And what I was going to ask the panel is that in their experience, and I'll probably start with Mick actually on this one, what's their experience in terms of not just sharing information, but what the expectation is, and when you do share the information, what do you expect your partners to do with that information?
Okay, so Lenovo was interesting because we insourced our manufacturing. So 92% of our manufacturing in Lenovo was insourced. So we almost bucked the trend, which made actually the process of controlling that whole sort of upstream supply chain a little easier. Three perspectives, I think, certainly in the roles I've done. I mean, and I'll be very quick. Upstream collaboration, obviously, in Lenovo it was about working with your sort of strategic partners, sharing any forecasts that you had with them on a sort of 13-week basis, and really just trying to synchronize that process. It was still relatively and it still is relatively unsophisticated in tech. Tech's quite complex because there's just so many moving parts to the supply chain. So upstream, downstream, you really want to try and understand. And we started to work with a number of the distributors, we call them the channel. So the sort of wholesalers, you'd sell into a wholesaler who would then sell into a retailer who would then sell into a consumer. And really it was very much about trying to get the distributors to give us their sales out data. And I can remember, I think the first year I joined Lenovo was 2008, and it was the year that there was that massive crash in Europe. And I know Acer ended up with sort of 5 boatloads of computers sitting on the ocean, and we were in exactly the same situation because we couldn't get sales out data, we could only get sales in data. So it was what the salesman had sold, and we ended up with this sort of massive wave of PCs just moving towards the distributors, and they weren't selling their PCs, and it ended up as a complete mess, and it staggered a number of organizations in our industry where we weren't naturally sharing that sales out data. I think the third area of data that we shared in Lenovo was really within the network. So we put a big end-to-end visibility system into our network, literally from one end all the way to the other, a thing called GT Nexus. And because the supply chain is so complicated, because there's so many moving parts and the data is so important, we had to put in a 3PL as a data manager, which was an interesting process. So we used the 3PL to basically manage the data that went into our visibility system. Because 162 countries we were delivering to, 32 factories we were collecting from, thousands of suppliers that were delivering into those factories. You only needed one piece of information that wasn't there, and literally the whole thing became irrelevant as a data process. So we used SIVA as that sort of layer to load, to make sure that the data was in the visibility system. As a function of that, SIVA were able to, their role, they were paid for timeliness, completeness, and accuracy of data. As a function of that, they were then able to take that data that they had for our entire supply chain and come back to us and sort of propose improvements. So it's quite a successful process, successful way of doing it.
It's very interesting you mentioned that, because actually that's quite similar to, more on the upstream side that Ericsson had, where they used effectively a 3PL to coordinate that data as it went out to suppliers as well. So clearly that is a model that other organizations do employ, so that and in that case it was to try and stop a supplier would be getting multiple different forecasts from the same OEM, and they wouldn't know which was the forecast that they actually had to rely on. So yeah, that was more on the upstream side where you described on the downstream, but actually I think that's an important capability. Dominic, what about from boards and the...
This is actually quite an interesting topic, and there's different facets to this, because if you look at this from the end user perspective, so from the retailer, the manufacturer, I am the owner of my supply chain, and then I outsource it out to a DHL, to a Siva, to Kuehne Nagel, or whoever, and probably it's going to be a variety or a mixture of all. And we have visibility clearly working with clients of what happens from the client perspective, and often the frustration that goes on once we put in these contracts, but also working with the 3PLs or 4PLs, we have visibility of what happens from their side and how they are changing their business to meet a changing and more demanding customer need. So what normally happens, you set up your contract with your 3PL, you set up terms, you run the contract for 3 years, we go away, or the 3PL goes away, sets up its operations, and it delivers, and we agree our costs, etc. And then we're in running mode. And the next time we really looked at how do we improve things is at contract renewal. And clearly, as a customer, you're trying to beat them up on price to come down, and they're trying to renew that contract, and there's this kind of 6 to 12-month negotiation before we renew this contract to say, we're going to give you more. And the only thing that's getting squeezed from their perspective is the margin on operations. So what we've found, and working with some of the 3PLs, is that they're now better equipping themselves to manage the contract in the contract phase. What does that mean? It means that all of a sudden, by giving data in more real time, rather than at the end of the month or when there's a problem, and sharing that back with you, it kind of opens their treasure box to, what's good and what's bad. But if that's a continual improvement process, that's going to drive tremendous efficiency in the supply chain and the customer experience. And what we've done with quite a few of the 3PLs is work with them on a customer-by-customer basis to provide real-time information, financial and operational, back to you, the customer, the manufacturer, so that you can improve to the point where they're running value share agreements. So what's in it back for you, what's in it back for them. So when it comes back to renewing that contract, I am very different to the next 3PL, which is just moving goods. So anyone can move goods, and any of the big guys can move goods from A to B to C, and we can all agree a cost. But if you can drive value back to the customer through data and through digital, then that's going to be a tremendous ally to that customer, rather than just another 3PL moving things. So that's what we've done and we're doing, and clearly extending that. And that's both financial and operational data. So that's what we're doing, to the point where things like plasma screens in warehouse to look at real-time productivity and efficiency. So you've got a time and attendance system, you've got a warehouse management system, they're all bringing out reports, but you see a report at the end of the day. I'll put plasma screens in the warehouse, look at picking, look at efficiency, look at returns, and all of a sudden you're driving improvement at the coalface, which is ultimately driving better profitability. So these are the kind of things that are happening, and also the way the 3PLs are kind of gearing themselves to really change their business model.
I think that just to add to that, I think and that's why we put Siva in place, was because we wanted that data, we wanted that real-time data, and when you're collecting from 3,000 suppliers, some of them in the middle of the northwest of China, you don't necessarily get that data. So the whole thing sort of breaks down. So you have to have this layer of sort of corrective action, if you like, in the whole process. Now, maybe at some point that will be automated. There'll be bots that move along the supply chain and just gather that data. And I'm sure when everything is digital, it becomes an easier process. But we're in that phase where everything isn't digital and some of your suppliers aren't digital.
I think that's right, and I think it is a journey, because clearly you can't fix everything. But if you can start looking at, the digital supply chain and what can we fix quickly, and what value does that bring ultimately to me as a business, either in profit or market share or reduced cycles or better forecasting and therefore lowering stock and stock holdings, depending on the sector, I don't think digital is and in collaboration is a big bang approach, but you can definitely go and deliver value in areas very quickly and then create that platform.
So my background's mostly consumer products. There, data sharing has really been one way, retailers to manufacturers. It's really been transaction level data, point of sale data, inventory. I think with the expectation that the manufacturers will analyze it, react to it, improve the service. You're starting to see that change a little bit with Walmart, for example, now generating an order forecast, so actually trying to provide a little bit more sophisticated data to their suppliers, again, obviously with the idea of better service, right? So it's been interesting. The retailers really set all the governance. I think Walmart's the strictest. But there hasn't really been any interest the other way in the retailers having any access to manufacturer data. They're really still kind of throwing it over the wall and saying, here's the data, I expect the service, I expect the goods.
Do you see that changing at all? You mentioned with Walmart a little bit
Yeah,
on one-way sharing.
Yes, so finally, I've been talking about this for 10 years, right? So the first step is obviously, as a CPG manufacturer, if you have the visibility, the retailer inventory point of sale, you can better predict what they're going to order, right? The next step would be collaborative inventory target setting, and then, because right now inventory is buffered at every point in the supply chain. You have this kind of phantom visibility when stuff's leaving your warehouse where, it ships in a spiky way, that's interpreted as volatility, right? And then eventually you're going to get closer to a true product flow. I hate to say VMI, but you're going to get the manufacturers leaning forward, taking more responsibility for on-shelf availability and having inventory in the supply chain.
Do you see that as a threat to some of the retailers? And the reason I mention that is that and you've talked about digital supply chain, we're talking a lot about omni-channel and things like that, that actually the retailers are now beginning to compete with the brand owners, with the manufacturers as well. So isn't that a threat to some of those retailers if they're not getting that insights from the brand owners or the manufacturers?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I had this vision where Walmart just owns the stores and everyone has to show up and stock them, right? I mean, they've already outsourced inventory management to the manufacturers, service. So I have to say I'm not sure on that.
So
I think the threat might be the other way around, to be honest. I mean, you think about the way digital works now. The whole, I was talking to a guy in the USA about a month ago, and he sort of gave me this statement that digital melts the supply chain. And effectively, that's what he described the supply chain now as a cheese toasty. What was component to manufacturer to brand to distributor to retailer to consumer is now completely melted. So manufacturer goes straight to consumer. A wholesaler goes straight to it becomes a sort of far more complex process. I'm not sure anybody's worked out the true implications of that at the moment. I'm not sure that
people are struggling with it, definitely.
The one thing that is certain is that we were seeing it in Lenovo. Omnichannel is starting to creep further up the chain, further upstream, and you are, as a manufacturer, you're starting to feel the impact of that sort of bullwhip that's gone back up the supply chain.
And that would lead, though, to more requirement for collaboration and data sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's quite a few examples where this has worked and is continuing to work. But I think also it's a two-way process, because clearly when it works, one of the examples I have is where one particular organisation outsourced, quite a large retailer outsourced, to various logistics providers, different parts of their supply chain, and where the organisation that was providing this visibility and this different way and collaborative working, they were actually then asked to take on much more of the business, because that was then the customer saying, hey, to all the rest, get in line and provide, I want this from everyone. And if you can't provide it, I don't want, the PowerPoints every month or the Excel spreadsheet every quarter telling me when my problem is, and then we can't drill down to the nuts and bolts of what's happening. So, having that more detailed visibility is important. Having that in near real time is probably more important than ever, and this stuff is happening now. And I think it's a two-way process. The question around, we're outsourcing, our supply chains more and more. What does that relationship look like? I think it's becoming tougher from both sides, and I think information and information sharing is key to linking that, because we've all gone out, the last 10, 15, 20 years that I can remember, we've all improved transactional efficiency. So we've got we're standardizing our GL, we're standardizing our warehouse management system, we've got a forecasting system of type, but are we then connecting that into our decision-making processes? And I would argue that right now we're not, but that's going to be now, I think, the transformational part of how do we use information from all this data that we've got.
So I was actually going to come maybe slightly more back down to some of the realities of sort of visibility and data sharing. Do you have examples? Does this create a very visible return on investment where you're trying to do the data sharing? Because it's obviously going to require a certain degree of effort and maybe investment in technology in your organization. And can you actually demonstrate a return on investment that the other delegates here can maybe go back to their business and say, well, actually, this is the return that we should be looking for, or these are examples of where we can get a return on investment? Robert, do you want to?
Sure. So we do a forecasting benchmark study every year, largely CPG focused, but looking at the impact of, in this case, demand sensing versus demand planning across $250 billion in business, P&G, Unilever, major CPG players. You're getting about a 37% reduction in forecast error. That translates immediately to service, inventory, lower costs. It's very clear if you do any supply chain modeling that the collaboration and inventory visibility, are tremendous ROI.
Similar. I mean, there's lots of organisations that sometimes you can measure that quite quickly in terms of forecast accuracy, and certainly in a retail or manufacturing environment that is key. I mean, people like from outside, H&M, Puma, global supply chains, very complex business, omni-channel in terms of H&M or large retailers. How are you driving a real rolling forecast into your output through your suppliers, and what does that mean in terms of stock levels and that kind of good stuff there. That's a very quick as in a very monetary return on forecast accuracy. The key there is then to bring in your actuals into the same place where your forecasts are, and monitor then how you're performing, so you can really have a rolling forecast with rolling actuals. But that ability to look at your actuals also allows you to look at all the softer side in your business. How are we improving customer satisfaction? How are we improving even our internal business? The work we've done, for example, with H&M, where we've rolled out almost a daily, certainly a weekly, in some cases an exception level of daily forecast across 8,000 users on a global business, multi-country, multi-continent, centralized through Sweden. That gave them tremendous. The project was around forecast accuracy, reducing stock or improving stock, and where, in a retailer, the stores can double up as also warehousing, so that whole omni-channel piece being managed. But then also going down into the stores and looking at, how are our employees working, the customer satisfaction, are they happy, have they got the right training? So looking really at the supply chain from a nuts and bolts perspective, but also from a people perspective in our organisation. Because if we can drive up customer, the interaction we have with our customer and every part of our business, then we can clearly have an impact on our brand. And that's more difficult to measure, but that's still about now different types of data coming into what is, stock, forecast, order accuracy, inventory, all the usual stuff we do.
I'll give you a very practical example. So for the last 2 years of my role in Lenovo, part of my job was about supply chain data and supply chain analytics. And in Lenovo, we were very late to adopt the concept of data and analytics. Not late on the sort of marketing and sales end. We were sort of scraping the web and everything, but looking at the way that the supply chain data works and using that to good effect, we were quite slow at. So I just invested in 5 guys, and they were part mathematicians, sort of, part operators. Cost me about £600,000, I think these guys were, based in Glasgow. In 9 months, they identified and started to deliver over £20 million worth of savings in the supply chain, just by doing that whole big data thing of starting with one problem and one piece of data and just going out and gathering, almost like a virus type process, just going out and gathering more and more information. They ended up writing sort of new quality algorithms for components. They ended up, creating an app for cost to serve. They started to look at days of inventory that we had in our VMI operations, where we had procurement guys who were just setting a days of inventory at 6 weeks, and that was it, because it was easy for them. And really giving the procurement guys an understanding of, do you really need 6 weeks? What happens if you take 4 weeks? What about 3 weeks? What's the risk and the cost implications of all of that stuff? So these guys, from my perspective, it was a very, very, very big return on investment. And pretty quickly, probably 11 months after I'd set this team up, the whole team then got moved to Singapore, where we set up a massive centre of excellence for data and supply chain analytics. Part of the value we delivered was actually working with suppliers and mainly with suppliers. So we worked with Intel and we worked with Targus to look at physically how our networks worked. And we had I'm not there now, so had a massive warehousing operation in Venray, where we were holding Targus bags. And bags, bags are horrible. They're just air. And you hold bags and they just take space. But just over the border in Belgium was a massive Targus warehouse. And we'd never really sort of superimposed the two supply chains on top of each other. And just by doing that and then going back to Targus and saying, well, why don't we drop the order on you? You pick it in your warehouse, bring it to us, and then pick to zero on our back dock. It saved millions and millions of dollars. And that's just the sort of, you start to go down these routes and you just find that value in there through data and collaboration.
Yeah, I'll say there's an IGD case study for Europe with Unilever where they've taken 35% of the inventory out over 2 years. Right.
And actually, that leads me really well into what I was going to talk about next, which is companies I talk to are often very confused about, well, is there a difference between visibility and big data? And so everyone is talking about, lots of people talk about big data, and big data, certainly a couple of years ago was very much a trendy thing to focus on. Robert, do you see that big data and analytics being substantially different to visibility? Because actually, I think what Mick was talking about there is actually probably the synergy between the two. And there certainly is a big overlap. So I was wondering what your view is on that.
We see a lot of confusion between big data and social media. So I had a call the other day with a company that makes electronic components, cables, switches, stuff like this. They were really they wanted to leverage Twitter and LinkedIn to improve their forecasts. And I'm like, guys, let's be realistic here. If you can't imagine how something is going to happen, chances are pretty good, it's not going to happen. So, the data that's most useful if you're working at a product level is data about that product. What are your customers holding? What are your customers using? What are your customers selling? I mean, those are all very informative. The idea that somebody comments on something they bought at Tesco versus the rich data that Tesco has, it's not making any sense to me. So I'm a very big fan of the visibility. I'm less a fan of, social media being the next step. I think people aren't even doing well with structured data they can get from their customers, much less, social media.
So it's interesting because big data is, for a company that works for 20 years in the data space, there's now clearly lots of nice buzzwords around visualization, data discovery, and now big data, and what does that mean? And so I think big data can mean different things to different people. So if we start with visualization and visibility of data, that's very, very different to big data. Visibility is around, I've got my data somewhere, I've got it in Oracle, I've got it in SAP, I've got it in a spreadsheet, it's with a supplier. How do I link that data to something that gives me near real-time, granular information and to the users in the way they want it? So that's around connections, that's around holding huge volumes of data, and technology has always been terrible at that. We've always seen nice dashboards that give the CEO, the COO, nice dashboards, and then I want to drill down to what's happening with that customer on that delivery right now, and there's a error code because technology doesn't handle that volume and that connection. So the first thing about, I think, visibility is around being able to connect the dots all the way down to the level of detail and give the end user, whoever that end user is across my operations, the information they need, and then give them the power to analyze that information. So drill down and say, why is this happening? But that's not big data, and I would argue that that's still not happening. And doing that alone will drive tremendous or different types of decision making in real time that hopefully will have an impact on the business. And there's lots of proved cases of this, and I think that connection still isn't happening, and that's something that can be done very quickly with the technology today. And there's lots of cases of that. I think then there's still a disconnection within business between the actual information and the forecast, okay, and the demand plan, the role coming from sales or whatever it might be, and then the marketing plan. So I think connecting the dots between, financial and transactional data, okay, making that digestible to the end users in our business so they can make information or decisions is key. Linking in the same place your planning process, I think, is quite transformative. That's key. But that's, again, those are processes that can happen. I think where big data takes it is to then say, now that we're handling all this data, so now we understand our customer behavior, we understand the demographics of that customer, we know that those type of, we know where they live, what age, what sex, all these things about our customer or our components or our suppliers, then can we mine that data to see patterns that we can then drive back into our marketing, into our forecast, and into our business? And I think that's where big data is going to give us, value. And so it's, first of all, do we have tools that give us that capability to analyze the actuals, link the forecast, and have a much smoother supply chain? Now, big data is around, analytics, the one part. We're doing loads of work with retailers where we're bringing in, loyalty card information, and we understand everything about the types of customers, what they're buying, and then we're homing in campaigns to say, right, Mick, you're aged 21, you live in a multi-million-pound house in Chelsea. What else, are people around you buying, and let's market you with that kind of information. So that to us is big data now, and that's not happened, and it's the kind of stuff that we're really driving into. But it's about fixing the right problem for the company at that time, and that's key for us.
I sometimes struggle with this because somebody needs to explain to me what big data is, because it's just a word as far as I can see. Is it the size of the data? Is it the complexity and where you're getting the data from? Or is it an analytical approach? And I think, you know, people, we don't do little data well enough to do big data yet. You know, we got what they call it to do. There's a thing called small data, isn't there, as well? Small data you know that's confined within your systems. We don't analyze our small data and share our small data well enough in organizations. Just leaping to big data is just you're gonna have mathematicians in charge of your company.
But I think
you're gonna go off in wild direction, which would be a great ride, but
that's an interesting one, because I was actually on the other side. I was at a conference, the Future of Finance conference just last week, and they were talking about, you know, what's next for finance. Clearly, the other side, and they actually mentioned 3 or 4 things that you've mentioned today, which is, you know, standardization, automation with technology, linking front and back office. Believe it or not, you know, that's where that's how our finance professionals are thinking. But one of the things I did say, which you touched upon before in your comment, which I thought was very interesting, is the types of people that we're recruiting within our teams might be very, very different. So they were talking about, you know, we've always recruited, you know, accountants, and we've always recruited people within our industry around, you know, the supply chain, understand the supply chain. But is there a view, like you did, Mick, you know, for different types of people that are more analytical and are using tools like, you know, analytical tools, you know, forget the big data for the moment, but analytical tools to look at patterns in our supply chain, in our customers, in our inventory, in whatever it might be. And so it might, you know, I think the role of finance, just like the role of, you know, our area, might have different types of people that are driving different types of analysis, which clearly is a different discussion for another day, but it's definitely something that we're seeing in different organizations and driving tremendous value then back into the business.
I've been trying to work out what, and you may be able to tell me, but what big data is now that relates to analytics, and what business intelligence is. Is it big data, or is it visibility? And I read this brilliant quote, which sort of confused me even more, to be honest. It said that business intelligence helps you find the answers to the questions you know. Big data helps you to find the questions that you don't know you want to ask, which is sort of I don't know whether that's confused people more or not, but basically it's saying big data is sort of, you go into the world of big data and you actually don't know why you're in that world until you find the question you want to ask. And I think the first part of that, answers to the questions you know, we don't do well enough anyway.
No, so I can give you a big data example. So my daughter's a summer intern at BuzzFeed, right? They're media. They have a constant stream of every interaction with their website, with any of their 3 apps, just scrolling there, right? So they collect a ton of data. Now, her job, she's on the data science team, is to try to figure out, like, what is sticky, what's the distribution, who are the power users, or the people that are there a lot, all that sort of stuff. So that was the first time I was like, oh yeah, you have a data science team at BuzzFeed? You think they're just making up these crazy quizzes, but you know, they're actually trying to do something here. So I don't know, kind of.
Fill those quizzes out.
So I guess from a technologist perspective, so where are we going with big data, which is analytics, but the next part of that, because analytics is now creeping in. You've got the data, you can mine the data, give you patterns, and that's giving you some better forecasting or better targeting or clustering of customers. Where we're going now with big data in the future is having what we call crawlers. So what does that mean? In your technology, so normally we connect to databases. We come in and we say, you know, let's connect to our GL, let's connect to our warehouse management system, connect to your transport system, connect to your forecast system, give me all this data, give me visibility, et cetera, et cetera. That is local connections and that internal, external. What we're starting to see, or what we're putting into our technology, are things like crawlers. What does that mean? It means that the system is going to point to the outside world automatically, Facebook, Twitter, social media. And it's going to create and detect patterns. Clearly, you've got to create rules, and we're not there yet. But it's going to then come back with a series of information back to you as a consumer. So you launch a new product, right? So you launch a new car or something, and you launch it globally, day one. Supply chain's in place, you're selling, your suppliers are there, it's all good. You know, you're starting to, and you understand the sell in, the sell out, the stock, you know, how you're doing against forecasts. You've got all that data because now you've got a great product that's giving you that. What you don't know is then the impact of that car, how it's being used. So crawler technology is sniffing information that's happening on Facebook, and if they detect patterns, positive or negative, which need to be interpreted, they'll come back and say, well, do you know that in Rome, there seems to be a huge amount of negative feed on, the new XYZ model of that car you've just launched. That allows you to, so that's not telling you what, it's just giving you some sentiment analysis that you can then go and understand and say, well, the axle fell off to that model in there, someone had an accident, well, let's go and have a look at whether or not our manufacturing plant in Italy had a problem, and therefore it's going to be an impact to our brand, so let's look at that now. So it's that kind of stuff that we're, for example, from a technology perspective, we're starting to put in, because we're thinking, I hear you that we're not where we need to be with little data and where we need to be with analytics, but I think that's something that's happening and can happen quite quickly in terms of what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. From a technologies perspective, that's the kind of stuff that we're putting in now for the future.
I want to pause at that point and give the audience, we've got about 10 minutes or so left, to give a chance to ask any questions to any of the panelists here. So, do we have any questions?
Yeah. So I'll go for the first question. In your experience across different sectors and industries, do you see differences in the maturity of use of technology to enable demand planning or supply planning? So I think right from, say, mining, retail,
Yeah, and I think a lot of it ties to margin. So, CPG was doing planning 25, 30 years ago when I started at Unilever. Pharma, it's really been more the last 10 years. They're thinking SAP APO is still going to solve everything for them. I think, on the supply side, tech is obviously one of the most sophisticated industries, right? Supplier collaboration.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the bottom line is that clearly you need to do it, but different. So, for example, we're seeing retailers huge adoption in, for example, analytics. We need to really understand our customer. We've got loyalty cards. We know what they're buying. We know the point of sale. We know where they bought it, what time. So when you mine transactional data or transactions, you can see time. You've got everything. Now you've got the actual person themselves. So that drives, better campaigns, different types of promotions, and all that kind of good stuff. So we definitely see that high volumes, where there is definitely a big element of stock, is important, because clearly better forecasting has an impact, direct impact in terms of your forecasting, clearly manufacturing. So where there's lots of data, lots of volumes, margins are being squeezed, is the traditional place where this has all happened. But we're starting to work now, for example, with legal firms. So we're going to the total different end of the spectrum where, law firms traditionally were making money, hand over fist. It was not a problem. Everything's going well. But now in certain parts of their business, for example, they're much more competitive. M&A and that kind of stuff, you'd argue that it's for the big boys. But when you're looking at things like conveyancing and that kind of stuff, there it's being automated, and therefore margins are coming down, and therefore you need to look at data in a totally different way, and therefore you need to forecast, you need to automate, and so it's for everyone. But we've definitely seen a strong adoption in retail, manufacturing, that world there, but now it's moving across. We're seeing across all areas.
So you're saying the link is, as margin comes down, you have to do more work to get value from the margin you've got.
Supply chain becomes more important.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Certainly the case in tech now, because you look at PCs have become the most commoditized commodity ever.
Right.
You're making 2-3% on a PC. So now you have to start to look at how you collaborate and how you drive more value out.
And I would add to that as well that, for example, the life sciences companies where the margins were huge, and now margins are reducing, and they're looking forward at the patents expiring and going off the patent cliff in the coming years, that they're suddenly playing catch up, and they're actually progressing very, very fast. So I think this year, for the first year, when we look at the Gartner Top 25, we had 2 life sciences companies in the top 25 supply chains. So they are catching up as an industry. What you also get, and I don't know if the panelists would also see this, is that in some industries, CPG is a very good example, where you've got some of the examples of the highest level of maturity and the most advanced capabilities, but also some examples of the least advanced capabilities. And the companies who haven't developed these type of capabilities, I think, are increasingly at a competitive disadvantage. I think you're seeing that in retail as well. Companies who haven't developed this in retail, this type of capability, the visibility and sharing, are increasingly at a disadvantage, particularly as we're going more into an omni-channel world. So you get these polarizations in certain industries. And there are some industries, automotive is a very good example, where they have almost the highest level of maturity in terms of the short-term execution ability in the supply chain. And actually they have a very high level of maturity in the long-term planning, but actually there's a big void in the middle where they have potentially a very poor level of maturity and visibility. So you get some differences between different industries.
Let me ask you guys a question. How do you see, we talk about the industries, the different sectors. What about the 3PL world? Are they adopting it? Because they are traditionally the sort of big ogres of the rest of the world, that they don't move as quickly as anybody. Are you seeing them adopting the sort of big data approaches?
I think they're adopting a more collaborative way of working. Certainly the work we're doing with some of them is driving some amazing case studies in terms of the relationship that they're having back with the customer, the value that they've created. I mean, they often spoke about value, that it was just moving things in a contract. But the real value that they've created, being able to go back to the retailer, the manufacturer, and say, hey, actually, by putting this in place, look at the kind of efficiencies that we're driving that can be monetized or not. But the sticky bit is always who pays for it, right? So there's that hurdle to happen. And I think as they're maturing in terms of their adoption of, they'll probably try it on 1 or 2 accounts, probably where we started on a couple of renewal accounts. We need to do something fresh, energetic, go back to our customer with something that shows them that we really care. And so let's invest in this tech stuff or this digital stuff to show them. And then you win that contract, you get into business as usual, and you use that almost as a case study in your business to say, hey, actually, if we did this across all our customers and we had this as a platform and we actually took this seriously, it could be part of our business development tool for new customers, for renewals, and actually it can really transform the market. So I think in a traditional, if I was in terms of the 3PL world, you've got different types of threats that are coming, as we know, and I think being able to harness information and leverage it back to the customer and become a partner to that customer. So to you, back to Lenovo, and telling you things that you don't know about your supply chain, all of a sudden you're going to listen to that 3PL rather than the next one. So that's happening.
Time for what? There was one question down there. I think we've got time for one question.
Thank you. So it was interesting listening to the connections that you discussed in terms of how you link things together. I think you've touched on it most in the discussion. Working for all of the retailers, you mentioned Walmart, working for Walmart. One thing that frustrates us is not having one end-to-end model. So from a situation of sale of stock to ordering of stock to manufacturer, through the supply chain to the DC to stores, do you see in the future that there's going to be a solution that gives us one package instead of one warehouse system or one supply system, one store system, and that's why we're so big in Walmart in terms of our expectation.
I was just saying, I think it's a stretch to imagine a single system. I mean, it's sort of even SAP hasn't delivered that, for a single company yet. I do think you will have you know, a real-time connectivity. You'll have a supply chain operating network, multiple participants, sharing of data, and I think you'll get the coordination, but I don't think it'll be sort of...
So I promise we don't know each other, and you didn't. I didn't pay you to ask that question, but I think this is kind of the kind of white elephant in the room. To me, when we look at technology is, and it's very easy. It's thought of outputs in terms of silos. You know, I buy a reporting system for operations, and it might sit on top of my WMS. I buy a sales forecasting system. I buy a financial planning system. I buy a transactional reporting system. I might buy that nice dashboard. And they're all different technologies. There's no link between, you know, a holistic view of financial and operational data and the link between a strategic plan into a financial plan, into an operational plan, and then into, you know, demand planning, forecasting, and S&OP. It's all disconnected. And that's because technology has always seen things in silos. And then we stitch this all together through spreadsheets. And, you know, the moment you do that, you're kind of back to square one in terms of, is this really the truth? So our perspective of this, in terms of our approach, has always been about, we call it integrated business planning and reporting. It doesn't matter where you start in terms of your P&L. You might start with your strategic plan, but it needs to be tied into one place. So you need to be able to link financial objectives with operational objectives, visibility, linking a rolling forecast with actuals. And then I was talking about before about the visibility between, you know, financial and operational data. To us, that's where it needs to be. That's certainly where we play. In terms of where you start, you know, you can have a big ERP approach where you try and do everything, and I would probably not recommend that. But I would definitely recommend looking for a tool that can really in one place hold financial operational data with your business processes is key, because they are all linked. But technology seldomly does that. So that our approach is really to do that.
I mean, in the old world, it was literally about getting your ERP to do all that. But so many people have spent so much money over such a long period of time, and often failed, that probably, and that's that sort of inside-out approach. Probably now what Dom's saying is it's now about a sort of GUI outside-in approach. It's built on the outside, based on the outside data. So I think it's a different approach now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists, and I think everyone's got now follow-on meetings to go to. So thank you very much for attending. And if you've got any questions and you bump into the panelists in the rest of today, please feel free to come up and have a quick word with them. So thank you very much.